This is part 2 of my Q&A series, still working through questions that I invited quite a while ago now. So let's dive straight in. Issue-based questions first, and a couple about my own context at the end. Patreon supporter Kenneth asks this question. What will it take for the European community, including the UK, to put to bed the hope that President Trump will ever engage in good faith efforts to mediate between Putin's Russia and Ukraine and her allies? Clearly, Moscow is using Trump's clumsy and disingenuous meddling as cover for even greater aggression. Indeed, I wouldn't be surprised if the vast majority, perhaps all of them, have actually already come to that conclusion. But you have to see the landscape of choices and consequences in the same way that they will, where they may not feel the United States is ever going to help, but they're aware there are many ways that the United States could choose to hinder, maybe even catastrophically so. So they're likely to be following some variant of the following playbook. Gradually take over the practical action required to support Ukraine and put pressure on Putin, but do so in a way that preserves the illusion that the US is still an essential ally, because that illusion is still helpful. Hence, they will flatter Trump into sort of staying on side. It won't ever get him to demonstrate leadership on behalf of, the old rules-based world order, or indeed of Ukraine. But it might persuade him not to go actively batting for the other side. The Europeans have the complication that they are all in deep trouble within their domestic political situation, because the rise of right-wing populism, the assault that it's making on the institutions of democratic governance, mean that they will struggle to divert the resources to defence spending that they'll need to fill in the gap by American withdrawal, at least not without provoking even more backlash that could cast them out. And not merely cast them out, replacing one government with another very similar government, where traditionally they all tended to view the national interest, foreign affairs, broadly through the same pragmatic lens, but lose to parties that are pro-Russian, anti-democracy, bent on destroying institutions for no better reason than they are radicals, and they have no ideas of what else they could do that's radical. All of this contributes to a public space where what these various actors say about how they see the situation, how they really see it, is more sharply at variance than usual, leaving us to do the precarious business of trying to read between the lines without hallucinating things that really aren't there. Of course, there has always been a gap between what's admitted and said publicly and what's going on behind the scenes, and that was usually about issues, about how certain things would land in other parts of the world, not upsetting those who you're negotiating with, not tipping adversaries off and all of that sort of thing. But we are into a new situation where you have an incredibly thin-skinned baby in the White House with authoritarian tendencies, crafting things to land gently there, while still having any semblance at all to reality, is something of a bigger challenge for all of us. Manuel asks this: what are your predictions for the landscape of politics/politics in media? I think we can all agree over the past 10 years, something has changed to make it more radical and in-your-face polarizing. Do you think this is a temporary era we're living through, or do you think this is now the status quo for politics in an online world? History strongly suggests that whatever status quo we're in, however enduring it appears to be at first glance, it is always temporary, which can be a good thing or a bad thing, depending what comes next. There have been times of greater polarization in the past. There have been times of greater common cause in the past. The era of the online world has changed some of the dynamics of that, because we are edging towards a global society, and that's new, which is hilarious in one sense, because the people who are bringing that about are the ones who are supposed to be against globalization. So the US is deeply polarized now. It's going through the motions that we often associate with the run-up to civil war, or whatever that might look like in a industrialized country in the modern era. But thanks to social media, it is actively exporting that polarization to a good part of the rest of the world. Not equally, but those that have been most affected by the US soft power of storytelling and culture sharing in the past, those are the ones that are most affected by this now. This won't be a disease that only affects the West, but we are getting it first and big time for various reasons. The logic of this position is that a period of polarization and conflict will eventually exhaust everybody. There will be some sort of cathartic release, and then you'll move on to a new phase. We'll assume we survive that cathartic release. That phase will be rebuilding structures that have been torn down. It will probably move the pendulum back on what's considered acceptable free speech versus what is malicious attempts at radicalization, because human beings are rubbish at getting the balance of this right. No doubt it will go too far in the opposite direction, but that will take time, and it will be better for a while until the negative consequences of the overcorrection start to kick in. Rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. However, we are into genuinely new territory because the swinging pendulum of sentiment in human societies, that's something we've seen before, but just not amplified in the way that it is being across the global stage. Not with such a large community of people who have trained themselves to talk so skillfully the language of conspiracies and cynicism and disinformation. That is such a destructive force. I can't imagine there won't be a corrective to it in due course. It's just that there's no precedent for exactly what we're doing to ourselves right now, nor indeed for what should or could come next. Patreon supporter Ben asked this question. Given that the Trump tariffs are affecting or going to affect US businesses, why are the US stock markets at near record highs? A wise man once told me that stock price is the expectation of future earnings. By that measure, it seems that the markets are expecting a new golden era. Yet news reports show US farmers have no market for their crops, China and other industrial manufacturers are laying off staff. Can you help clarify this apparent contradiction? All that anyone can offer on this is speculation at this point. Stock prices are the result of aggregate human behaviour, augmented at this point by various algorithms and so on, but still predominantly human reactions. My expectations about this would include the following. 1. Trump's constant announcements and retreats, chopping and changing. Big announcement that scares everyone and then retreating back again. It has numbed the market into a state where they've just stopped worrying as much as they had when he first introduced his tariffs. 2. Markets have in the past been caught out when they were generally complacent in the face of changes that were clearly taking place but hadn't yet appeared in the numbers. And 3, that is made possible when you have a mix of sectors and some of those are doing well, and that is masking the impacts on some of those that are starting to show problems. The US stock market's very much buoyed at the moment with the performance of artificial intelligence companies and to some degree tech stocks generally. What we've seen is some extraordinary valuations driven by the expectation that this is game-changing technology, it's going to dominate wealth creation in the short to medium term, and United States companies are leading the charge, and that dominance will therefore be sustained. And this has been enabled by the fact that the most recent earnings reporting season has generally held up, not showing signs of immediate problems. Now, if you look beyond that, you might notice that a lot of companies are avoiding offering financial projections in the short term, which perhaps they would have been giving in the past. And it's not because they know they're going to go down. They would probably want to flag that up if they thought they're about to have a bad earnings report in the future, just so that the market doesn't get surprised by the news when it happens, because it's the surprising the market that can often drive your shares down. But because with Trump policies changing daily, they just can't forecast because they don't know what's going to change tomorrow, or indeed how the existing setup is going to play out in terms of consequences. For those that have given forecasts, many of those forecasts have gone up. Some companies had been expecting an extreme negative situation back when the tariffs had first been introduced, but now they've largely been cut down to size. So their situation, which may not be great, is nevertheless better than they had feared it was going to be. So they raise their expectations. That gives a positive direction of travel, which feeds sentiment in the market. The main issue for all of this is that the impact of Trump on the economy should be expected to play out over the long term. The jobs situation is an early leading indicator, which, thanks to the deportations and the federal government firings, has shown an impact very early. Of course, that makes it more likely that then the Fed cuts interest rates, and the markets would like that prospect, so that feeds into the shares staying up. A lot of the other indicators will take time to show up. Historical high valuations often precede a bigger crash when a shock comes along. So make no assumptions, we'll just have to see how it plays out. The Exum Ridge asks this: did we learn all the lessons from Kamala's defeat? That is maybe where focus can help prevent the next manipulation. Now the question's ambiguous about who "we" is in this context. Bear in mind, I am not a partisan, I am not an American, so totally an outsider. I assume your question isn't about me, it's about the political opposition to Trump, so I'm going to take it reframed as: did Democrats, or maybe even just did the left generally, learn all the lessons from Kamala's defeat? From my observation, political parties very rarely learn the lessons from defeat. Not that they can't, just that generally they don't. That's because the nature of political activism is always to believe that your particular flavour, your preconceptions are correct. When there's a setback, you persuade yourself that if only you / they had followed your preferred policy or campaigning approach more vigorously, then defeat would have been turned to victory. An easy thing to believe because it depends on an untestable counterfactual proposition. So Democrats on the radical wing will say, if only we're more radical, we will be successful. Those on the moderate side will say, only if we dissociate ourselves from the woke extremes will be successful. And like all conflicts, the temptation is always to prepare yourself to re-fight the last conflict rather than to prepare for the next one. I do see signs that many Democrats understand that they allowed their public profile and their campaign messaging to become too disconnected from the concerns and perceptions of ordinary non-political citizens, the swing voters. Some of them understand that Mamdani's success in New York was a lot to do with his ability to cut through on those basic bread and butter issues with policies that may not turn out to be practical, but they're bold, they get people arguing, and so in the Trumpian playbook kind of a way, they reinforce with people that here's somebody who cares about them and the problems they're facing. That matters more to them than very specific policy proposals. At least that tends to be the case in the United States, particularly on recent evidence. There are all sorts of things like that, but they're not the lessons for the next election. Because the next election will be the one where you have an administration actively dismantling American democracy, boasting about gerrymandering to give themselves an advantage, while displaying mock outrage about the other side retaliating. And the shocking reality is that the majority of the American public show little sign of much caring about any of that stuff. This is the kicker. The huge political challenge, because in the last election, they spent a lot of time talking about how Trump would destroy American democracy. And now we know they were right. We're seeing that they were right. And it's still not going to be a vote-winning issue for them. Not sufficiently. It's still going to be about the question of whether people feel better off in their own lives because of the actions of the current government, the incumbent. They don't see or they don't care about the alliances that Trump is burning across the world and how that might damage America's standing. They don't see or care about the politicization of the Law Department, the FBI, the use of them to pursue political revenge attacks. They don't see or they don't care about all the grift and enrichment of the Trump family and their friends and allies from the use of the office of the presidency. It's still going to be about, do they feel bad or better in their life? And if they do they hold the Trump administration to blame or for credit for that? Or do they accept the line that it's all because of immigrants, for instance? And bearing in mind, the administration is doing everything it can, having only had a short time to do so, but nevertheless, to at least put its foot on the scale, to give it some degree of unfair advantage in the election process. That raises the temperature, it raises the stakes. Going to take an extraordinary feat of leadership and good campaigning on behalf of the Democrats to overcome those obstacles. The thing they can't afford to do, in my view, again as an outsider looking in, is to allow the campaign to always be on the defensive in the face of the attacks from the other side. Nor can they allow internal divisions any breathing space. Indeed, in 2028, assuming the candidate isn't Donald Trump, there will be scope for the MAGA side to be the one that is suffering internal divisions that spill over into the public. That is a very high likely scenario. Parties divided amongst themselves rarely win elections. All right, a Canadian patron supporter, Rick, asks this question. There have been recent stories of a discussion of a $500 million loan to Albertan separatists from the Trump administration. If true, it would be an obvious attempt to destabilise Canada, or worse. I am wondering whether a separatist vote in Alberta might result in enough justification for Trump to make a military move on Canada, quote, to support the democratic choice of Albertans to separate from Canada. Firstly, I think it's certainly to be taken seriously that the Trump administration could be working covertly to try to push Canada into what it would see as a more receptive space. Given their operation in Greenland, we've seen them do that. So to be taken seriously, yes, although my instinct is that this is not highly advanced in a covert way, because this is quite a leaky administration. I think we would probably know about it. What we have heard about, as you say, unconfirmed, but it would absolutely fit how these things work, this suggestion of financial support to encourage Albertan independence. And yes, the Trump government would probably welcome that. And we should bear in mind as well that Russian and Chinese disinformation operations also actively seek to stir up exactly that sort of internal discord. So America wouldn't be alone in seeking to resource such outcomes. But then the question, do I think it would be used as a justification for a Trump administration military move? No, I don't. Largely because it would be a longer-term process before it arrived at that point. Trump is not a long-term planner. Also, he would be squeamish about the use of military force in a context that would resolutely shift the US into the global pariah category for much of the world. Trump, remember, is an authoritarian. He's not a skilled authoritarian. His ruthlessness is short-term, ego-driven, capricious. He can bluster a lot and threaten a lot, but that sort of move would not be his style. Now, you could also ask, would it be impossible to envisage a MAGA successor to Trump being much more at ease with such a move? And no, on a medium-term timescale, I don't think such a possibility should ever be ruled out, but I think it's unlikely. They would much rather make Canada's life economically as desperate as possible so that it will elect a compliant MAGA-friendly government in the future, and then the two countries start by building a special relationship that progresses and deepens over time. That would enable them to progress their agenda, but to keep their powder dry for the battles they really want to fight in certain other places. All of that obviously speculation, because it very much depends on who becomes the inheritor of the MAGA mantle, whether they continue to tighten their grip on the country. American patron supporter Michael asks this, which is a good follow-on to that question. The United States is clearly on an authoritarian trajectory. Is the UK going to follow suit? E.g. when Thatcher became She-Reagan. Will the US poison politics in the UK, or are there such fundamental institutional, social or cultural differences that it is a low risk? It's important to note just before we start that Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan had a lot in common, but she didn't style herself on him at all, and she predated Reagan's term by a couple of years. But yes, right now we are very much importing a lot of American political toxicity into our discourse, as are many countries across Europe, as we've discussed. In that sense, the US is already poisoning politics here. We had a very large demonstration in London yesterday, organised by the hard right figure Tommy Robinson. That was addressed by video link from Elon Musk, who basically told them they should be prepared to use violence because in some way unspecified, they, yes, the undefined they, would be bringing it to them. A shocking, disgusting message from across the pond. Well over 100,000 attended that rally. So it may still be a minority in the country, but it is clearly growing in influence. Mainstream politicians are reacting to it almost on a daily basis. Now, as you say in your question, there are indeed some very strong differences in institutions, social norms and culture between the two countries. If Nigel Farage's Reform UK, our MAGA-like party of the moment, if they did get into government, they would have a lot of work to do attacking institutions just to get them to the state that the United States began at before Trump was even elected. So, for example, we have a non-partisan judicial appointment system, which for decades has done a pretty good job. No system run by human beings is perfect, but it works. Leading Reform UK figures have said that they quite think we should move to the political appointments process that they have in the United States. I find it hard to conceive of how you can be in the United Kingdom, look at the state of the judiciary in the United States and think, oh, yes, please, I want us to look just like that. Not least because in the US, the Supreme Court is there to judge on whether new laws are constitutional. In the UK, it's about interpreting cases based on the letter of legislation and common law precedent. Very different processes. No particular rationale as to why the UK version would benefit by being influenced by politics. So they might try to change that. There would be massive resistance to it. They're not highly competent, so they would probably end up deciding to focus instead on a smaller subset of priorities. Also, they couldn't gerrymander elections, wouldn't be tolerated by the British public, and we currently have an independent system. They couldn't just make far-reaching random executive decisions without passing legislation through Parliament. We are not a presidential system. Now, of course, they could do a lot. They would do everything they could, and they could make us look like a clown show in the face of the world, as indeed we were when Boris Johnson and then Liz Truss were in charge. But I don't think they would have the power in the short term to put us on the same authoritarian path. We are just too far away as a starting point. And I don't even think that Nigel Farage wants that himself. I think there are others around him that might. But things could get pretty ugly regardless. Jennifer asks, why do you think nothing sticks to Donald Trump? Why is there never enough evidence or judicial will for him to face severe accountability for his actions over the decades? Also, what accent is that? Is it the Midlands or ... My grandparents were English Northeast, but your accent fascinates me. Now, of course, Trump has lost numerous court cases in his time, and he has seen a number of his businesses fail. So it's not exactly true that nothing ever sticks to him. Nothing ever comes back to him in terms of consequences. The context where that is the case is as a political actor. And it is genuinely baffling to those of us old enough to remember the trifling matters that used to be sufficient to sink a political career. Indeed, even today, in the UK, let's contrast again, Ambassador Peter Mandelson with Donald Trump. Mandelson was also a friend of Jeffrey Epstein. Mandelson stuck by Epstein when he had his first conviction. By how he wrote to him about it, he seemed persuaded by Epstein that it was a wrongful conviction, and he was standing by him as a true friend. However, in the later days, when it became known really how awful things were, then of course he distanced himself and said he regretted ever having known him. There is no evidence he took part in anything. There's no naked woman drawings or birthday cards or any of that, but he's just been sacked, because it was held that by not dropping the connection when Epstein was first convicted, that put him beyond the political pale. Trump, however, for all that the connection clearly caused him strong discomfort and ripples within his base, so far as we all know, he sails on regardless. I think we could talk about the phenomenon for quite a while, but we can touch on a few factors. So one, the US has become viscerally tribal. So even Christian fundamentalists have been inclined to wave away Trump's failings because he is their man. The tribal divisions have become more important than anything else. More important than the Constitution, more important than the rule of law. So yes, more important as well than what may be presented as peccadilloes. 2. Trump doesn't do shame or embarrassment. He never apologises, he never explains. Faced with a revelation, he either waves it aside as unimportant, denies it, and then turns it into an attack on the other side. It is actually highly effective as an influencing technique. Doesn't work in a court of law, which is why he has been prone to losing court cases. Now, of course, lucky for him, he won the election and was able to make the outstanding court cases go away, not because of merit. Thirdly, he's good at distraction. He can tune into what will chime well with his base, throw them things that they will line up behind, and because of tribal dynamics, that just works. This is why I say he couldn't have achieved this in, say, the 1980s, when that didn't exist. He would never have gotten to the point where he could seriously be taken as a candidate in the first place. The hyper-partisanship of Newt Gingrich, the Tea Party, all of that started to make the eventual emergence of Trump possible because they subsumed all factors other than fighting and beating the other side, no cooperating across the aisle. You asked about my accent and punted a guess at the Midlands. Very well judged. I actually worked to lose my accent. Very few people spot it at all, or certainly can place it. The reason was that my original accent, Brummie, was considered then, and has remained ever since, rated as the most stupid sounding accent in the country. We do well by doing what we can to minimise obstacles to our endeavours, at least that's what I try to do, but not well enough to fool you. Patreon supporter Karen asks this: I liked the What Should Brits Do video. As a Brit, I actually did something. I wrote to my MP and got a surprisingly long email back. What should Brits do about racism? Thanks for the question, Karen, and good for you taking action, because people often underestimate how useful contacting their MPs could be. Personal, thoughtful contact rather than the form, letter, campaign communications that MPs tend to get bombarded with. So the question, what should Brits do about racism? It is a huge question, needing more time than I can give it here. So just a couple of thoughts. In my experience, racism comes from fear of the other, disconnection from reality, and tribal membership. One of my earliest memories seeing how this works was when, as a young man, hitchhiking. Remember that? Back in the 1980s. I got a lift from a lorry driver who told me he was against all of these foreigners in the country, except, he said, for the Eritreans. He'd worked with Eritreans in a previous job, and they were great hard-working people. So you could see how it worked with him, where he could lump all of those people together on the basis of what he read in the more divisive British tabloid press or whatever his sources were, and he could maintain a frankly racist prejudice. But where he had direct experience, he'd had to get to know people as people, not as abstracts. He wasn't able to maintain that mental model, so he made it into an exception. Often, the ordinary people who maintain racist attitudes do so because they see subcultures within their community, they see mini ghettos next to them that look alien, and they are scared by it. And they may also see their local communities rapidly changing in some of those areas where recent enhanced immigration rates have been concentrated. That likewise scares them. And of course, the actual racist activists feed off that fear, promote it by spreading stories designed to increase it, to turn it into righteous anger. If you're a politician, you should be worrying about and engaging with those activists, the amplifiers, because yes, they are poisoning our society. If you're not a politician, I think you start closer to home, making people as visible to each other as individuals as possible, just taking small steps on a day-to-day basis to try to puncture that circumstance that can lead to alienation. So recognizing that people's fear of the unknown is normal and legitimate. The key to diffusing some of the hateful stuff is to find ways, in whatever your own context is, to make the unknown familiar, to get people to know each other as people, not as racial stereotypes. Now look, any answer of this length ends up feeling trivial and trite because it's such a big question. Okay, a couple more questions to and about me specifically, because those of you who watched my previous Q&A will remember that I said that I'd been involved in the Green Party in the UK back in the early 1990s, moving to the Liberal Democrats I think in 1993, and then leaving party politics altogether around the turn of the millennium, since which I have been unattached, a floating voter. So in the context of all that, Tom asked this question. An interesting video would be on the evolution of your political thinking from the Green Party to Liberal Democrats. Yeah, I hate to disappoint, but I think it's going to be less interesting than you might imagine, because I was really very politically non-ideological in those times. I joined the Greens because at that time there was clearly a window of opportunity for them to be a vehicle to influence the broader political agenda, on environmental policy specifically. Within 3 years it had become obvious that they just weren't in a state to be able to make use of any such opportunity, and indeed the window had really started to close on them already, because all the other parties had updated their environmental policy platforms. So my move to the Liberal Democrats was a pragmatic choice, because they were the one that seemed to be most open to the environmental agenda, led at that time by a leader who was personally committed to it and also good enough to help them punch above their weight, namely Paddy Ashdown. So again, they could be a vehicle for influence. I thought I could be useful there. I left politics when I realised that actually pragmatic would be change agents, could do better elsewhere, and you probably did want to be more of a political animal to thrive in that environment. Hence why I moved on to working with businesses to get them engaged with problem solving instead. And I'm afraid my determined pragmatism has been at the heart of my voting patterns ever since. I'm aware that it's not always a good thing in politics because there is a role for principles, but I think it's very much been, up to now at least, a major factor in how the British actually vote in elections, because we have traditionally voted for parties who are within sight of a centre ground and have some degree of competence. And as a broad, horrible generalisation, I see centre-right parties as being vehicles to generally seek to boost the wealth creation of a society. Centre-left parties then need to come in to correct for all the people who don't do well in that system or fall between the cracks in the process. And those two are existing in a dynamic, healthy tension with each other. Our politics does best when there's good faith opposition, scrutinising and holding to account, no side benefits when they have an absence of that. It's all very mechanistic and process oriented, but there you go. That's how I see it. Obviously there are more layers than that, but if you're asking me to describe my journey, I'm afraid there's not a great deal more than that. Final question comes from Patreon supporter Ricardo. Huge fan and early Patreon supporter here. However, gotta love those howevers. Bring it on, Ricardo. Would you describe the topics covered in the last months as audience capture, dear Mallen? Let's acknowledge and celebrate the slight snark in the question. Even my Patreon supporters are entirely able to give me a good prodding when they think I deserve it, and good for them. I appreciate it because no doubt sometimes I do deserve it. So the question is this one of those times? Well, Ricardo is referring, I guess, to the fact that so many of the videos I'm doing now have Donald Trump very firmly in the centre of them. I sometimes get these comments under the videos themselves, things like, "Oh, you used to cover a broad range of topics," and "Oh, you're obsessed with Trump." And the ones that chime with Ricardo's work here, saying, "Oh, you're just chasing views. You've sold out." Because those more wide-ranging and better videos of the past used to get paltry numbers of views. So I guess I have a two-part answer to this. One is my perception is that I still just talk about the things that I'm interested in. I did a video pre-Trump arrival, I think, when I said I was going to stop doing climate-focused debunking or explaining videos, which was a large chunk of what I used to do. I felt like I'd covered the territory, all the different challenges to climate science and policy. And I said in that video, I was frankly bored with the low level of that discourse. As for the rest, I always talked about what was current, what was the interface between science and policy, about geopolitics and issues around democratic decline. Obviously, I did some around the politics around COVID-19 when that was big, and plenty about the Ukraine war and other factors affecting the future of our society. I think I'm still talking about all of those things. It's just that the leader of the most powerful country in the world has deliberately and consciously inserted himself to the heart of all of them and is massively upending the previous dynamics of all of them. People sometimes say, "Oh, why are you obsessed with Trump?" as though my videos go on and on about, "Oh, you'll never believe what Trump said today, and did you see what tie he was wearing," or whatever. But I don't do videos like that. I mean, I reserve the right to do them occasionally if I want to, but I don't think I have. And if I have, not more than once in the last 3 months. I do videos about the war in Ukraine and Russia and the changing world order with China and America competition. I do videos about the massive upending of world trade with the tariffs, how that's being turned into extortion, how the various countries of the world are responding and adapting and changing their alliance structures. I talk about the democratic decline of, yes, the most powerful country in the world, which of course used to define its role as being the most powerful promoter of democracy as the model for the world to follow. Also the knock-on effects of democratic decline in other countries. And yes, views are slightly up when the thumbnail includes Trump, not guaranteed, but usually, and when the title relates it to him. But normally that's what I should do because he is genuinely at the centre of that issue. In any case, using a title and thumbnail to seek to get the biggest audience for a video, the content of which you believe has integrity and is important, that's not what I understand to be defined as audience capture. Following an audience's preferences and losing yourself in the journey, that's what I define as audience capture, and my understanding of how other people define it. Hence why we've seen a number of figures who started on the centre-right-ish, who drifted further and further into the wilds, the likes of Jordan Peterson, David Rubin, Brett Weinstein and all of that. So no, not in that lane right now. If that changes, I expect rather a lot of people will let me know. That's point one. Point two is that I have changed how I'm operating here, obviously. And maybe some of that is the difference you're noticing. So Trump came in with a strategy to flood the zone, as we all know. At that point, I decided to start doing daily videos because so much was happening, so much was changing, there was just a lot to talk about. Now, I used to do just 2 or 3 videos a week, sometimes just for one. That enabled me to do deep dive videos on one topic quite a lot. And it's true that the mere fact of doing daily videos means you end up doing much more immediate, much more topical, and also much shorter videos. I'm aware of that as a change, pondering whether I want to do something in relation to that. but that's a stylistic question. Whatever you decide to do, you lose some of the people who wish you did the other thing. And that's just a fact of doing this sort of content. All right, that is surely enough for now. My thanks to everyone who asked questions. Still lots I couldn't get to. Apologies to those. I will try and get to them at some point in the future. My particular thanks, of course, to those Patreon supporters. As you know, couldn't do any of this without that support. Always immensely appreciative for those who are in a financial position to join that important group and give that support. That's all for now. See you next time.